Okay, so you want to own a medieval winery. You picture terraced hillsides in Burgundy or the Rhineland, monks singing in the distance, casks aging quietly in a cool stone cellar while merchants queue at your gate begging for a taste. Here is a real number. A single vineyard belonging to the Abbey of Cluny in the 12th century required roughly 1 full day of skilled labor per year for every 12 to 15 vines just to keep it alive, pruned, staked, and weeded. A modest vineyard of 10 acres could carry somewhere around 8,000 vines. Read that again. 8,000 vines, each one demanding individual attention multiple times a year, none of it automatable, none of it skippable, for a crop that could be wiped out by a single hailstorm in June. A medieval vineyard was not a passive asset quietly ripening into profit. It was one of the most labor-intensive, capital-hungry, and fragile businesses a medieval landowner could run, and the wine in your cup was the last surviving evidence of 100 decisions that could each have gone wrong. Before you plant a single vine, you need to understand what you are actually buying into. Because a vineyard by itself, a bare hillside with good sun exposure, was worth almost nothing. What made a medieval winery valuable was the entire apparatus wrapped around it. The legal right to sell wine within a given town or region, often a monopoly held by a monastery or a lord and jealously defended in court. The press house and its equipment. The cellars, cool and dry enough to store wine through a hot summer without it turning to vinegar. The coopers who built and repaired your casks. And crucially, the roads, rivers, or river ports that let you actually move a heavy, fragile, perishable liquid to a buyer before it spoiled, or the cask staves dried out and leaked. Strip away the legal privileges, the equipment, and the transport network, and you had a very pretty hillside producing a crop nobody could get to market in drinkable condition. The vines were the least valuable part of the entire operation. There was also a legal dimension to site selection that grain farmers rarely had to worry about. Good vineyard land was not simply available for the taking. The best south-facing, well-drained slopes in regions like Burgundy and the Moselle had usually been identified, claimed, and fought over for generations, and a newcomer wanting to plant a vineyard on genuinely prime ground often had to buy out an existing claim, settle a boundary dispute in the local court, or negotiate directly with a monastery that already held the surrounding parcels and had no particular interest in a stranger planting competing vines next door. Surviving charters from Burgundian houses record repeated small transactions, a strip of hillside here, a few rows there, purchased or exchanged over decades as an estate slowly consolidated a single workable block out of scattered parcels, buying your way onto a genuinely good slope rather than settling for mediocre land simply because it was unclaimed could easily cost as much as the vines and labor that followed. So let's build one. The year is 1180. You are a minor lord, or perhaps the cellarer of a modest monastic house, establishing a vineyard on a well-drained south-facing slope somewhere in the Loire Valley or along the Moselle. The kind of land contemporary agricultural writers specifically recommended for viticulture over grain. First, the entry cost. Planting a new vineyard from bare rootstock was slow and expensive in a way grain farming simply was not. You needed cuttings, ideally from an established vineyard willing to sell or trade them, stakes cut from managed woodland to support each vine, and above all, labor to trench and prepare the soil by hand, since vines demanded far deeper and more careful ground preparation than a plowed grain field. Surviving monastic estate records from houses like Citeaux suggest that clearing and planting a single arpent of new vineyard, an area a bit under an acre and a quarter, could consume 10 to 15 days of skilled labor before a single grape had grown, on top of the cost of the stakes and cuttings themselves. For a modest 10-acre vineyard, that easily represented over 100 days of skilled labor just in initial planting, plus the ongoing cost of maintaining it through its first 3 to 4 unproductive years, since a newly planted vine yields little worth pressing until its 4th season at the earliest. At a skilled craftsman's wage of roughly 3 pence a day in this period, that planting labor alone comes to something in the range of 25 to 30 shillings, before counting a single stake, a single day of the 4 fallow years that followed, or the press house you still hadn't built. Now the running costs start, and the first one catches almost everyone off guard. A vineyard needs more skilled hands per acre year-round than almost any other medieval crop. Grain farming had its brutal peaks at plowing, sowing, and harvest, but long stretches of relative quiet in between. A vineyard had no quiet stretches. Vines needed pruning in late winter, a skilled and unforgiving task since cutting wrong could ruin a vine's yield for years, followed by staking and tying as new shoots grew, then repeated hoeing and weeding through spring and summer to keep competing growth from choking the roots, then a final round of leaf thinning before harvest to let the sun reach the grapes. Estate accounts from vineyard-owning monasteries in Burgundy record dedicated vine dressers, a specialized and better-paid class of laborer distinct from ordinary field hands, employed nearly continuously through the growing season, rather than only at harvest. A vine dresser in this period could command close to 4 pence a day, roughly a third more than an unskilled laborer, precisely because a mistake in his hands cost you an entire year's crop, rather than a single row of turnips. Harvest itself brought its own labor spike, since grapes had to be picked at precisely the right moment of ripeness and processed within days before rot or wild fermentation set in, meaning a vineyard that employed a handful of vine dressers through the quiet months needed to draw in dozens of additional pickers, often the same village smallholders and their families who supplied labor to the neighboring grain fields, for a frantic week or two of picking, carrying, and treading. Getting that timing wrong by even a few days, either picking too early and losing sugar content or waiting too long and losing whole rows to rot, could measurably change the value of the entire year's vintage, which is precisely why the decision of when to begin harvest was rarely left to the vine dressers themselves and instead sat with the cellarer or lord directly. Here is where the costs get genuinely interesting, because the single largest capital expense on most medieval wineries was not the vines at all. It was the press house and the cooperage. A proper wine press, whether the large beam press used in the great monastic cellars or a smaller screw press for a modest operation, required substantial carpentry from seasoned oak and a skilled master carpenter to build and periodically repair it. But the real recurring drain was barrels. Wine could not simply sit in an open vat. It needed to age and travel in tightly cooperated oak casks, and a cask was not a one-time purchase. Oak staves dried, shrank, and leaked. Hoops, whether wood or iron, needed regular tightening and replacement. A cooper's fee for a single large cask in this period could run close to a full week's wages for a skilled craftsman, and a working winery of any real size needed dozens of casks in rotation between the press house, the aging cellar, and whatever was currently on a cart or a barge headed to market. Account rolls from wine-producing estates along the Rhine show cooperage as a recurring annual line item nearly as large as the wages paid to the vine dressers themselves, a cost almost nobody outside the trade ever thinks to price in. Here is something else nobody accounts for when they picture rows of casks quietly aging in a cool cellar. Wine in this period was extraordinarily prone to spoiling before anyone ever got to drink it, and keeping it from turning to vinegar was itself a recurring expense. A cellar had to stay cool and reasonably stable in temperature year-round, which meant serious stone construction dug at least partly below ground, not a simple wooden shed, and a cellarer had to rack the wine periodically, drawing it off its sediment into a fresh cask, both a skilled task and one that risked exposing the wine to the very air that could spoil it if done carelessly. Sulfur candles burned inside empty casks to help sterilize them before refilling, and wax or resin used to seal cask bungs, and any bottles destined for higher value sale were small individually but added up across dozens of casks in rotation every single year. A poorly kept cellar could turn an excellent vintage into vinegar within months, and monastic account rolls occasionally record entire casks written off as spoiled, sold at a fraction of their expected value to buyers who wanted vinegar rather than wine. A humiliating but real outcome for an estate that had done everything right in the vineyard only to lose the value of the crop in storage. Now here is the counterintuitive part that genuinely surprises people. Transporting the finished wine often cost more per barrel than growing and pressing the grapes that filled it. A full cask of wine was extraordinarily heavy, and moving it any real distance overland by cart over rutted and often flooded medieval roads was slow, expensive, and risked staving in a cask on a bad stretch of track, losing the entire contents in an instant. This is precisely why nearly every serious wine-producing region in medieval Europe sat directly on a navigable river. The Moselle, the Rhine, the Loire, the Garonne, each of these became a major wine-producing zone, not purely because the soil was exceptional, though it often was, but because a loaded barge could move dozens of casks downstream to a port town for a fraction of the cost of the same volume dragged overland by ox cart. A vineyard planted on excellent soil a day's cart journey from the nearest river might produce superior grapes and still lose money, simply because the cost of getting the finished wine to a buyer who would pay for it ate the entire margin before it reached your hand. Revenue, when it worked, came in distinct layers, and the wine itself was only the most visible one. At the base sat direct sale of your own harvest, sold either to local taverners or, for the better vintages, to merchants buying in bulk for export to England, Flanders, or the towns of the Hanseatic trade network. Above that sat the banal press right, a legal monopoly many lords and monasteries held over the only press in a given area, forcing every smallholder with a few rows of vines to bring their grapes to your press for crushing in exchange for a fee or a cut of the resulting wine, often a tenth or more, whether or not you had grown a single grape yourself. Above that sat the tithe, since vineyards, like grain fields, owed their tenth to the church, which for a monastery that both owned vineyards and collected tithes from lay vineyard owners meant the same institution profited from wine coming and going. And near the top sat the export trade itself, where a merchant house with the ships, the customs contacts, and the storage capacity to buy an entire region's surplus vintage and carry it to a hungry foreign market could out-earn the growers many times over without ever pruning a single vine. Quality itself created a further layer of pricing entirely separate from raw volume. A vintage from a well-regarded slope in an exceptional year could fetch several times the price per cask of an ordinary year's wine from the very same rows, and the growers and monasteries with an established reputation for consistent quality, built up over decades of careful pruning and honest dealing, could command that premium reliably. While newcomer with technically comparable wine but no track record often had to sell at the lower, ordinary price simply because no merchant wanted to gamble a premium price on an unproven name. The single catastrophic risk sat above all of this, and it could arrive in a single afternoon. A late spring frost or a hailstorm at the wrong moment in June could destroy an entire year's crop across an entire region in hours, with absolutely no warning and no recourse. Medieval chroniclers across wine-growing Europe recorded years remembered specifically for catastrophic frost or hail damage to the vintage, entries that turn up again and again in monastic annals precisely because a ruined vintage was catastrophic enough to be worth recording alongside wars and famines. Unlike grain, which could sometimes be replanted with a faster maturing variety if disaster struck early enough in the season, a destroyed vine crop could not be recovered that same year under any circumstances, and severe frost damage to the vines themselves, rather than just the current year's grapes, could suppress yields for several seasons afterward, while damaged wood slowly recovered, or had to be cut back and retrained entirely. Hail was, if anything, worse than frost in the damage it left behind, since a heavy hailstorm could shred not only the current year's grape clusters, but the leaves and young canes the vine needed to photosynthesize and build up the reserves it would draw on the following spring. Meaning a single afternoon storm could quietly cost you 2 harvests rather than 1, with the second loss only becoming apparent the following year when yields failed to recover as expected. There is a documented case that puts a human face on exactly this kind of collapse. The chronicle records kept at the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés note a vintage in the closing years of the 12th century, so devastated by an untimely frost that the abbey's own cellarer was forced to purchase wine from outside estates simply to meet the monastery's own liturgical and household needs. An institution that ordinarily sold surplus wine now reduced to buying it at whatever price outside sellers chose to charge a buyer with no crop of their own that year. The entry survives specifically because the reversal was so stark. A house whose entire economic identity rested on being a wine cellar had, for one bitter season, become a wine buyer instead. And the account rolls show the cellarer scrambling to renegotiate contracts with tenants and neighboring estates that had, by pure luck of a slightly different slope or a slightly later budding variety, escaped the worst of the frost. So let's put real numbers on a year, because the shape of the risk only becomes obvious once you see it in a ledger. In a good year, a 10-acre vineyard of this kind might yield enough wine to sell perhaps 40 to 50 casks after keeping back what the household and its obligations required, at a price in the range of 4 to 6 shillings a cask depending on quality and distance to market, for a gross income somewhere near 12 to 14 pounds. Against that, vine dresser wages across the growing season run close to 4 pounds, cooperage and cask repair another £1.50, tithes claim roughly a tenth of the crop's value, close to £1.50 more, and transport by river to the nearest port town might take another £1. Total that up and you are left with a surplus in the range of 4 to 5 pounds, a genuinely strong return relative to the acreage involved. Converting at an unskilled laborer's wage of roughly 2 pence a day, comparable to something in the range of 25,000 to 30,000 modern dollars of surplus value from 10 acres. A return grain farming on the same acreage simply could not match. An average year looks thinner, a slightly reduced yield from unremarkable weather, perhaps some mildew pressure that a wet summer always brought with it, trims the harvestable crop down toward 30 to 35 casks, while every one of your fixed costs, the vine dressers, the cooperage, the tithe assessed on whatever did grow, barely moves. Income might land near 9 to 10 pounds against costs that still run close to 6.5, leaving a surplus nearer 3 pounds, comfortable, but noticeably thinner than the good year, with far less room to absorb a genuine shock. Then comes the frost year. The crop is not merely reduced, it is largely destroyed, and what few grapes survive on the most sheltered rows might yield only 5 or 6 casks worth selling for an income that could fall as low as 2 pounds. Against that, your vine dressers still need paying for the pruning and retraining work the damaged vines now desperately require. Cooperage costs barely soften since you still need functioning casks for whatever small vintage remains, and for the following year, and the tithe collector, though owed less in absolute terms since less was produced, still expects his share of whatever value exists. Total obligations might still run close to 4 pounds even in this reduced year, leaving you not with a thin surplus but with an outright deficit approaching 2 pounds, a hole that had to be covered by borrowing against next year's harvest, a harvest not yet proven to exist given how long frost damage could linger in the vines themselves. So who actually got rich growing medieval wine? Almost never the grower who simply tended excellent vines season after season, however skilled his pruning or however favored his slope. The fortunes were built by the men and institutions who controlled the layers above the vine itself. The great wine-producing monasteries of Burgundy and the Rhineland grew wealthy not purely from their own harvests, but from holding the banal press rights across an entire region, guaranteeing them a cut of every smallholder's crop, regardless of their own vintage's fortunes in any given year. Merchant families in port towns like Bordeaux and Cologne built lasting wealth not by growing grapes at all, but by controlling the barges, the warehouses, and the export contracts that let them buy an entire region's surplus in a good year and still profit handling a smaller volume in a bad one, since their margin came from moving and reselling wine rather than from the fragile business of growing it. And the sharpest operators diversified deliberately, holding vineyards on multiple slopes with different sun exposure and different frost risk within the same estate, so that a single catastrophic June hailstorm striking one hillside left another, a mile away and angled just differently enough, untouched and ready to cover the shortfall. The Bordeaux wine trade in the centuries after our period shows exactly how this pattern hardened into a durable institution. English and Gascon merchant houses operating out of Bordeaux did not merely ship wine, they controlled the customs assessments, the barrel gauging standards that determined how much wine a cask legally held for tax purposes, and the credit that growers needed to survive between one vintage and the next. A grower who took an advance from a merchant house against next year's crop was, in practice, locking in a buyer and a price well before he knew whether frost, hail, or a wet harvest would leave him with anything to sell at all, which meant the merchant captured the upside of a good year through volume, while the grower absorbed nearly the entire downside of a bad one. The families who built lasting fortunes in the wine trade were, almost without exception, the ones sitting on that side of the ledger in the counting house of the port town, rather than on the hillside among the vines. A medieval winery looked, from a merchant's table in London or Bruges, like the most refined and civilized form of wealth a lord could produce, casks of good wine standing as a mark of taste and status alike. But underneath every cup sat a business that demanded more skilled labor per acre than almost any other medieval enterprise, that could be wiped out entirely by a single storm in a single afternoon, and that turned a genuine profit only for those who controlled the press, the barrel, and the river rather than simply the vine. The wine was never the wealth. The right to press, store, and move it before nature or distance ruined it was, and that right belonged almost always to somebody standing well outside the vineyard rows.